Dr. Paul Nesserode will introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Hello, hello.
Thank you, Sally. Welcome, everyone. Let me add my welcome to you. Thanks for coming out. It's my job to introduce our speakers and sort of just set the table for us. So let me refer to my notes here. This will be a conversation between two insightful and very careful Christian thinkers, our own President Kevin Brown and author and editor Jake Meador. The conversation is designed to cover a range of topics related to the pursuit of the good life and the building of authentic Christian community. President Brown, as most of you know, is the 18th president of Asbury University, where he previously served as associate dean and associate professor in the Dayton School of Business. Prior to higher education, he worked for nearly a decade in the banking industry, serving as a market president in his final 4 years. His education includes an undergraduate degree and an MBA from the University of Indianapolis, along with 2 degrees from institutions in Scotland, an MA of Letters from St. Andrews, and a PhD from the University of Glasgow. Kevin's graduate background incorporates economics, philosophy, and theology. Jake Meador, who has chosen to hop in his car and drive all the way from Lincoln, Nebraska to be here with us this evening, 12 plus hours, I think, maybe 1 o'clock last night. We're so thankful that he's here. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, where he studied English and history. His written works have been published in many noteworthy outlets, such as First Things, Books and Culture, National Review, and Christianity Today. He also serves as editor-in-chief for the publication Mere Orthodoxy. He's the author of 2 books, In Search of the Common Good, Christian Fidelity in a Fractured World, and more recently, What Are Christians For? Life Together at the End of the World. The content of which is serving as sort of as a backdrop for the discussion this evening with the second book. Now, I've had the privilege of seeing a list of weighty topics and interesting topics that they'll be directing the conversation, and I think it's best if we let our discussants get on with it. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jake Meador and President Kevin Brown.
Okay, welcome. Am I? It's a little on. Yes, okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, folks in the balcony. I'm super excited about this evening, and it is a real privilege to have Jake Meador here. I've read Jake's work for a long time. We've had some email exchanges in the past, and so it's great to meet you in person. And we met 5 minutes ago, and now we're diving into a conversation. Just very quickly, I was talking with a student the other day and just talking about like our media diet, and I just said, I think more important than someone's ideological background, that matters, that's important, but is someone just a really good thinker? And find those really good thinkers and engage, consume, interact with their work. And on that list for me is certainly Jake. He's just an incredible thinker, he's an incredible author. Whenever he puts something out, whether it's long or whether it's short, it's always meaty, it's thought-provoking, it's faithful, it's challenging. And so I hope that is your experience as well this evening. And I just want to jump right in. So let me start with the topic of our talk tonight, the name of your book, What Are Christians For? This seems like it could have a couple of meanings. One, what are Christians for in a sense of utility? What are we supposed to do if 5 people are in a room and one of them's a Christian? So what? I was thinking of Francis Schaeffer's example of you're in an alley in the middle of the night and a group's walking the other way, but then you discover they're coming from a Bible study. Like, what does that mean? What significance does that have? And then, what are Christians for in the sense of what are they about, as opposed to what are they against, what are they for? Was there a particular meaning you were aiming for there?
The title grew out of a Wendell Berry essay called What Are People For? Mm-hmm. And what Berry was trying to do in the essay was confront what he thought were some very simplistic, reductionistic ideas about the human person that were then being used to justify a bunch of other policies and practices that he wanted to oppose. But to oppose them best, he wanted to get behind the issue and say, like, it's not really about like policy X or Y.
Right.
The way that you've imagined the human person is off. And so, of course, the policy is going to be out of whack. And so that was kind of, I was writing that book, it came out in 2022, I think. So I was writing it during COVID. And amidst, like, basically, especially if you were in media, probably also higher ed, like 2015 onward has not been a very conciliar era in Christian media, Christian higher ed. And so those were kind of the questions on my mind, and I was not happy with the dominant answers really coming from any of the highly visible, obvious factions that might want to answer that question. And so I was trying to answer it in a different way that was grounded and informed by, I mean, ultimately, biblically, I think you trace it back to themes you can find in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, but then historically, very deeply grounded in Catholic social teaching, which is a tradition in the Roman Church that goes back to 1891, I think it is. Pope Leo XIII wrote a document called Rerum Novarum, which was basically about property and worker rights. And if you followed like the Roman Church's, like the new Pope, there's the name Leo XIV because he's trying to carry on the tradition of the last Leo. But then also Dutch Calvinist thinkers like Abraham Kuyper, Herman Bavinck, who were facing these same problems at the same time as Europe was encountering radical ideologies, cultural change, technological changes, and they were trying to figure out how do Christians locate themselves in this rapidly changing world. And so that was kind of the same thought that I had of trying to kind of draw on both of those traditions and put something out that was, to my eyes, different than the dominant stories that you can find most readily, and hopefully is helpful for readers both in a kind of day-to-day way and also in a more conceptual, how do I think about this thing I'm seeing in the news or this question in a faithful way. That's a little bit rambly, but that's kind of how the book came together. And books are, I think it's hard not to ramble when you're describing the process with a book. So
No, that's wonderful. You mentioned Roman Catholic. I was thinking about an experience in graduate school with, there was a Roman Catholic student, and we had to get up and present our thesis that we were working on so we could basically get criticism and try to come out with something better on the other side. And this gentleman was really making a strong environmental case. And so in my American eyes, he may have had a kind of progressive set of ideological beliefs. But at the end, he just kind of gave this beautiful, like, well, because I'm pro-life. That's why this is so important to me. So how much of what you're describing is perhaps a problem of impoverished anthropological view of what a human or a Christian is, and how much of it is maybe this side of the pond, we're so entrenched in these well-worn political grooves that kind of contour how we understand our faith or anything else?
So I think the kind of dominant life narrative that a lot of people kind of work out their life from, you could say, is this idea that we exist to accomplish certain things, to achieve certain things. You get to the end of your life and you can say, I built that, I did this, I accomplished this. And so that actually can become, there's something good there in that God made us to work. He gave us talents, he gave us abilities that we ought to use in service of others, and that will often manifest itself in things that we build or things that we do in our lives. The troubling dynamic to that is that if you anchor your account of meaning and worth and dignity in accomplishment, then there are phases in a person's life where they're not able to be accomplishing something, because they're somehow vulnerable or somehow engaged in something that's taking up all of their attention and energy. And if you frame dignity in terms of accomplishment, then you see those people or those moments in life as kind of being some kind of like failure or interruption in the human project. And so, like, my friend Leah Sargent has a book coming out in a few weeks called The Dignity of Dependence. And the way she begins that book is by saying the world is the wrong shape for women. And what she means by that is there are all of these passages in a woman's life where she is not able to pour herself into a job 40 to 60 hours a week. And what our world has essentially done, and Abigail Favale is another woman who's written on this really well in her book, Genesis of Gender, is we've basically said, okay, render your body like a man's, and now you can participate in the world just like everyone else. And Leah says, why should I have to do that? And so we have a form on it in the next issue of the magazine that I would highly recommend, with 3 responses from the different people reviewing the book. But I think that insight that Leah has, that there are passages in all of our lives where we are not able to accomplish in the way that perhaps the marketplace or certain schools or family members might expect of us. Certainly we enter the world unable to do that. We will exit the world unable to do that. I was on sabbatical in August and had 2 family members go on hospice in that month. So I spent more time in the hospital than I had in a while. They were profoundly vulnerable in that place. And if your account of dignity is not grounded well, you don't know what to do with that. There's a really arresting passage at the end of Hannah Coulter. My friend Grace Olmstead's written about it on her Substack. So Hannah Coulter is this farm wife, kind of one of the great characters that Wendell Berry creates in his work. And Wendell Berry, of course, is from this part of the country. And as she's writing, so the novel's written in first person, Hannah kind of narrating her life. And it's the end of her life. Her husband has died. Their kids have moved away from the farm. There's not really any reason to think they'll come back. And she's wrestling with this question of what was it all for? And there's this wonderful line. Well, so Gracie observed in her piece that she uses very active verbs throughout in how she talks about it. So even in this kind of vulnerable end of her life, she's actively engaging it. And she has the line to the effect of, I've decided to remain to see what becomes of a life like ours in this world. Yeah. And those are little things like the active verbs, the choice of that word remain. But it kind of contains a world within it of assumptions about the good life and the human person that sees value and dignity and worth as being anchored in something other than what you can accomplish, how much money you can make, what you can offer your employer, how you can change the world, however you want to phrase it. It's an alternative account of dignity that is really important to recover, I think. Especially like in the United States, we have a very large, like the largest generation in American history is retirement age now. And we have countries all around us in the Western world passing these really, frankly, barbaric laws about medically assisted suicide. And so being able to recover a more robust sense of dignity and anchor it in a better story, it's always important, but we are going to be confronted with those kind of questions very regularly in the years to come. And so being able to answer those questions well is really important.
Yeah, as you're saying that, the David Brooks, resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And this is where, and I know she's written with Miro, Lydia Dugdale has been really fascinating to me. And I would suggest to everyone, The Lost Art of Dying. It sounds like a morbid book. It's outstanding. And this idea of, one, the intuitive versus the incisive mind of asking, like putting a patient before you and like, what are the goals? What's the purpose here? Instead of like cutting like a scalpel, I think she says. But this idea that we come to the end of our life and we begin to ask these big questions, and she calls that a bad death, that this is not the time to raise these important questions, but rather, if we raise them earlier in life, we'll know how to live well if we know how to die well. And for me, just a bit of vulnerability, I was thinking through that with my wife. When I frame my end-of-life sequence in that manner, I don't think of, year over year, 3% increase in sales, or whatever the thing is we might put on a resume. I'm like, I really want my kids to know I love them, even if I'm a terrible father. I want to have a rooted kind of relational ecosystem and network with people. I want these things, but in our day-to-day lives, we seem to go after a different set of things. And I wonder if that relates to what you talk about in the book, a kind of like whole life philosophy, as opposed to what, perhaps? Like, what is not a whole life philosophy?
Yeah, so when you mentioned Dr. Dugdale's work, what will probably, I don't imagine we will publish something better. Hopefully we do someday. I'm a magazine editor, so I always want to publish something better. But one of Lydia's students is a friend of mine named Justin Hawkins, and he has an essay we published a number of years ago called Dignity Beyond Accomplishment, that is about his younger sister, Jenna, who has Down syndrome. And in my 10 years of editing the magazine and 15 years of being involved with it, it's my favorite thing we've ever published. So, if nothing else, look it up and read it. You might need to, there's an email gate you might need to get through, but it's just a wonderful, wonderful piece that offers a much stronger account, I think, of dignity than what we have on offer. And you mentioned Dugdale, so that just reminded me of it. Yeah, so the whole life thing that I set up in the start of the book came out of an experience I had on a flight. I was flying from Johannesburg to London, and I was sitting next to this man who has since gone to his reward. He died a few years ago, and he had a open black shirt, open collar, and fell asleep pretty quickly after we got on the plane, but it's like a 12-hour flight, so you have time to kill. And while he was, I thought, sleeping, I was watching a movie on the in-flight kind of back of the screen called Cry Freedom, which was this story of a civil rights activist in apartheid South Africa named Steve Biko, who was murdered by the Afrikaner police, and a white Catholic liberal journalist named, liberal, classically liberal, not politically left-wing, Catholic journalist named Donald Woods, who had become a friend of his, and eventually, because of his advocacy for Biko's cause, after Biko was murdered, was put under house arrest and fled the country, and had this very dramatic escape where he used the identity of a priest to sneak out of the country, and then his family was able to follow him, and he went into the West and basically told Biko's story. So I watch this movie, I go to sleep, I wake up in the morning, and the guy next to me is awake, and we start talking, and he mentions that he saw the movie I was watching and asks me what I thought about it. And I tell him, not really thinking anything of it, and then he goes, well, did you notice that at the start of the movie it said two identities were concealed to protect the people being in the story? Because the film was made in the 80s, so as young Denzel Washington plays Steve Biko. Did you notice that they changed the identity of two people? They said that in the opening credit. And I was like, oh yeah, I did see that. And he goes, well, I was one of them. So I'm like, oh. And so then he turns out, and he had a clerical collar that he had kind of tucked under his shirt. He was a Roman Catholic priest. He was the priest that had given his passport to Donald Woods so Donald Woods could escape the country. Putting his own, because if Donald had been caught, they would have traced the passport to him, obviously, because it was his passport. And so he told me this story, and this guy, he had been a missions priest in South Africa for 50 years. He had learned multiple languages as part of his service in these townships, and he'd worked for the good of the townships in all kinds of ways, sometimes as simple as raising funds to help provide clean water, sometimes helping get a church established, but it was all one thing for Father Ted. And it always struck me as a really powerful picture of what our lives can be in the world as Christians, in that we care about the whole person. We recognize the whole person as being made and beloved by God. And so we don't chop people up into parts and then only try to serve one part of them. Father Ted's example to me that I tried to honor in the opening pages of the book is like, yes, we tell people about the gospel, we tell them about Jesus. We also work for justice for them when that is required. And we also seek, when there are physical, tangible ways of aiding them, we seek to do that. And I think that also, to take it back to Leah's book as well, part of the reason we do that is because autonomy is not the normal human state.
Yes.
The individual isolated unit is not the default kind of mode of human existence. You enter this world only because someone else's body sustains you for 9 months. And you grow up in the world, hopefully, with the love of two people providing for you and sustaining you. And so that contingency and dependency is something we all share. And so being able to recognize that and name it and then respond to the person in their fullness and not in these kind of reductionistic ways that we often relate to people, I think is very central to Christian communal life. And I think it's a very strong opportunity for us to model a better way of life to our neighbors outside of the church.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that a moment. What a great quote. Autonomy is not the normal human state. I see one of our philosophers in town, Sidney Pinner's here, and he's used this expression before, our precious autonomy. And I think Kant also had a similar sarcasm, the dear self. And so you remark that in the book, these relational dependencies are actually a part of the good life. And this seems to rely upon a very different kind of understanding of freedom than modern notions of liberty that extol this kind of unencumbered free choice would suggest. Kirsten Sanders, another great author in the recent magazine, this was a great line. She said, "The bound life is the freer one. The bound life is the freer one." So how would you, could you talk more about that autonomy, but even how would you define the freedom Kirsten's describing?
Yeah, so another friend of mine, Brad Littlejohn's written a lot about political authority and how we understand power and authority. And in the course of talking about that, I once heard him use the illustration of a parent teaching their child to ride a bike. The child is going to be equipped to do this thing that they couldn't do before, that is delightful, that is good. But the way that they get there is they actually have to learn a kind of form, they have to learn a skill, and they learn it through attending to what their parent or whoever's teaching them is teaching them to do. And so the child is actually more free and is being equipped for even greater freedom in the future. You can ride your bike down to the store, or you can do any number of things once you have this skill. But they're being equipped for that and kind of sent out through a loving authority that is telling them this, not that. So I think that's part of the answer. Mm-hmm. The other thing I was thinking about is, so to go back to Barry, he's 91 years old and he has a novel coming out next month, as one does.
Yes.
And the title of the novel is Marce Catlett, The Force of a Story. And that phrase, the force of a story, I think is really powerful. Because like one of the other things I talk about in the book is this very stupid thing I did when I was in college. I managed to I got my car stuck in a snowdrift about 30 miles southwest of Lincoln snow, so obviously middle of the winter. When I went out, it wasn't almost zero, but by the time I got out there and got stuck, it was almost zero. And it was like late at night, so I tried calling my friends to get me out, and none of them answered. So then I called my parents, which like you never want to have to make that call at like midnight, because you make the call and then you hear your mom's voice like get very sharp very quickly because she's terrified. And I was fine, but
Mom, I'm alive.
Yeah, I'm alive. I'm okay. Just stuck out in the country in 0-degree weather and 30 miles from anything, but okay. Long story short, my dad drives out and pushes me out of the snow, asks me if I know this service station on the edge of town. I say yes, and he's like, "Why don't you follow me?" And he didn't mean that as a question. So I follow him into town, and when we get to the gas station, I tell him thanks for like the 13th time. And what he said to me was, he said, "Oh, I got my car stuck way worse than that when I was your age, and my dad always came and got me." So it's a really simple thing, but it's actually quite profound. My dad, and I've since heard stories of how he got his car stuck from my grandfather, and it was much worse than anything I ever did. He got it stuck in a river once, and they had to have like 3 vehicles pull my dad's Jeep out of the river. And so, but for my dad's thing was like, look, this is what being a father is. My father did it for me, and now I'm doing it for you. And the implicit message, of course, is being, and someday you'll do it for your kids. And I've found myself doing that now. Like, there's been nights where I'm sitting up with a sick kid on the couch, or like whatever it might be, and I remember that story. And so I think the angle here about boundedness and freedom, like, I don't want to imagine my life without the bounds, as it were, that come with caring for those kids. I don't want to imagine my life as a child without my dad having those bounds. And I also don't experience those as oppressive or somehow like cramping my style or something. Like, it's not what it is. It's fulfilling a calling that I've been given by God, that it to some measure I have chosen, and that I am now fulfilling, and someday my children will fulfill. And I mean, another piece of this is that, maybe to go back to another point from earlier, is that as our parents age, we also have ways of serving them, just as they once served us. Right. So, yeah.
Along those lines, I pay attention. You mentioned the market earlier and worth, and I actually think modern advertising is really fascinating to pay attention to, because quite literally, they can't afford to read the times wrong. So it's interesting to read their slogans and look at their marketing campaigns, because they're really making some kind of a astute cultural commentary, and the incentive structure is organized in a way to reinforce that. And so I have this weird collection of like different expressions, but my favorite is from Ariat. Am I pronouncing that right? I don't have any Ariat clothes. Okay. If I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm sorry. ARIAT. But they had this slogan, "Don't let the world tell you who you are." And I thought that was really fascinating, because if we're looking for the kind of like rooted, durable, free identity that Kirsten was right about and you're describing, maybe that's what we should do. You mentioned your dad is like, that's what I do as a father. When I started this role, a seasoned president said to me, and this was such fascinating advice. I thought it was funny at first, but they're spot on. He said, there are going to be things that you will have to do and you won't want to do them. But the president must do them. And the president will take you with them. And it's very true. I recently came across this great Simone Weil. She really loved this story she heard about a young sailor who evidently did this like extraordinarily brave act, and was interviewed later about why he did it, and his answer was, had to. And so she used to tell that story a lot. I'm a sailor. That's what sailors do. That's what presidents do. That's what fathers do, mothers do. And so it's actually being bound up in that identity that we actually find a kind of rootedness and then find a freedom within that rootedness that I hear you describing. Along those lines, and you touch on this a lot in the book, what do we lose when we lose a sense of rootedness or a sense of place? Because it seems the wind is blowing us in that direction.
Yeah, so it was... So this summer, I had a weekend retreat. I've got a group of friends. We all met in college, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, through the campus ministry that we were a part of. And just got on really well, enjoyed each other's company, and just decided we wanted to stay in touch after college. It's one of the best things I think any of us have ever done. And so we're now, our first gathering we ever had was in 2009. We've been getting together every summer ever since. It started off 3 days, now it's 4 days. Just as, changes in phase of life, and we've been able to do some different things. But as I was sitting around with them at one point, I was just realizing, like, I'm at a point in life now, I'm 37, where just in terms of kind of the arc of a person's life, I'm running out of time to basically develop relationships that will ever have that level of closeness that I have with them, just because we've known each other for 20 years. And then I was already thinking about that, and then while I was at the retreat, one of the guys was turning 40, and his wife arranged for a surprise 40th birthday for him while we were all in town. And so we had the surprise party, and then my family was there because we had our retreat in southeast Nebraska. And at one point, I'm just standing out there talking to my wife, and my friend John, one of the guys in the group, walks up to me and addresses me in this way that's inside joke we had from way back in college. Somehow my wife had never heard it before. And so we had to explain this entire thing to her. She and I have been married for 14 years. That was just a part of me she'd never come across. So there's a depth to those relationships that we have because of the amount of time that we've spent together. We were roommates in college. We'd go to coffee shops together to study, prep for things. We get together now. And I mean, in the years since then, one of the guys, his wife was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and she died 5 years ago. And now my kids and I sometimes leave flowers at her grave because she's buried in Lincoln. I think you don't really appreciate what long-term connection to something brings until you've had it, which makes it tricky to be able to understand the value of it, because you kind of have to commit to it in some sense first. And I think being rooted in a place and being rooted in a community can be very similar in that respect. It was just this past weekend, so Nebraska is with football the way Kentucky is with basketball. And so Husker football is kind of the state religion in some ways. We say that on game day Saturdays in Lincoln, Memorial Stadium's the third largest city in the state of Nebraska, because Memorial Stadium packs in 87,000, and the third largest town in Nebraska is 50,000. Farm state, rural state, low population density. But I took my kids, because it was a Division II school, 11 a.m. kickoff, which is great for families because you get really cheap tickets. And I was able to take them, and I was sitting there thinking, this is the same part of the stadium that I was at a game with my dad almost 30 years ago. This is the team I've been watching my whole life, that my dad has memories of watching in the 70s. You develop this very strong sense of connection to a place, and it becomes a kind of platform, I guess you could say, for then being able to share that with others. And so my kids are growing up with a sense of rootedness in southeast Nebraska and appreciation of these things that make that a unique place that are distinct from other places. And so it's a chance to give yourself to something, to attend to something closely over a long time, and to be shaped by it and to be surprised by it. And you can't really get those goods any other way, I think, other than Eugene Peterson has the book A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And I think that there's kind of a long patience in the same direction involved with a kind of rooted community or rootedness in a place that's just very hard to replicate. I mean, even there's the Psalms sometimes liken the wise man to somebody who's rooted, like a tree with roots beside the water. There's something that's very hard to replicate apart from some kind of long-term commitment, which is not to say that, like, don't make an idol of place, don't make an idol of these things. Your ultimate call is to know and love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, and sometimes God will call you someplace else, and you should follow him and not make an idol of the place you've always been, which is a temptation I can have. But I do think there are very real goods to be had from committing yourself to a place for a long time. And if you haven't had that experience, it can kind of be hard to name those ahead of time.
Yeah, along the lines of place and commitment, wanted to talk about commitment to institutions. And you had written a viral article in The Atlantic on Michael Graham and Jim Davis's book on de-churching. 40 million people de-churched. They used to go to church. They stopped going to church over a 25-year period of time. But you had this really interesting line in that where you suggested that young adults perhaps weren't leaving because of the demands of the church. Rather, they were leaving because the church was not demanding enough. So that sounds really counterintuitive. Could you, especially I grew up in like the Make It Relevant, and like seeker friendly. So talk more about that.
Yeah, so what the data that Mike and Jim compiled with Ryan Burge found was that, so the standard narrative I kind of had in my head, and that I think a lot of people had in their head, was that we have all these people leaving the church, and it's because the church is just so terrible and abusive and corrupt, and that's why everyone's leaving, and we have to fix that, and then it will be better. Which is not to say, like, where there's abuse and corruption, that needs to be addressed very clearly and transparently. We need to value institutional integrity and the health of the people in our institutions, absolutely. But what the story and the data that I saw in the Great De-Churching suggested is that actually most people who leave are not leaving because of abuse or corruption. Mike and Jim called those de-churched casualties. The much larger group, I think like 2 to 1, if I remember right, was what they called casually de-churched. And what they meant by that was they were going to church every week or twice a month, and then something happened in their life to disrupt their routines.
Sports.
Yeah, youth sports was a big one. COVID was a big one. Others could be like, I got a job in a new town and I was kind of building a new life there, establishing new habits, and church just didn't make the cut. Or we had a second kid, life is crazy, I'm not sleeping, I never see my friends. This is the example I use in the piece. And then a friend of mine can meet for brunch on Sunday mornings and I haven't seen this friend in ages. I'm gonna go get brunch with my friend. So that's the kind of mental map that a lot of people are doing. It's not this like hostile to church thing. That was one of the other surprising things in their study, was they found a lot of people who have, a large number, I want to say almost half of the people who have left the church said they'd be willing to come back, and sometimes all it would take is an invitation from a friend to come back. But so what I looked at that, I'm like, so the issue is that church is not existentially important to people in a way that getting my kid to their sports event is important, or seeing my friend at brunch is important, or getting that getting that extra side hustle to bring in some more money is important. And so what I suggested in the piece is that actually, if we had higher expectations of each other in terms of our common life, perhaps that would shift, because we would actually recognize that there are needs I have for communal support, for counsel, aid, spiritual guidance, friendship. There's a need I have to give those things as well. And church is part of, like, I'm able to do that through church. I'm able to be reminded of God's care for me through church. I'm able to receive the Lord's Supper and be strengthened for my journey through church. And so the thought of the piece was that there's an opportunity for churches to take communal life more seriously and perhaps become a model of an alternative to a society that is very driven by, again, like autonomy, accomplishment, go out, do your thing, live your best life, create your own identity. And that we actually have a really powerful opportunity here, because that way of life is actually very inhumane and very isolating, and we could be the kind of oasis in the desert for a lot of people.
Yes.
But it requires, and actually, like where I'm from, I think the harder thing it requires of people is not being willing to serve. We have tons of people in churches in Lincoln that are willing to serve. We don't have anyone who's willing to ask for help. So it requires being willing to like acknowledge your own need to the community. Like I had a pastor friend just last week texting me complaining about how independent we Nebraskans are. Because he's like, I have all these wonderful people in my church who love Jesus, who are great people, and they can't help anyone because no one will ask for help. So I think that actually in some ways is maybe the harder thing, is taking the step to kind of normalize asking for help in your community. That's another thing Leah talks about in her work. And then it does also mean like having the willingness to show up when someone is in need of some kind of support. And I don't know if I used this in the book or not. I think it might have been something that got cut in edits, or maybe it's the first book, I don't remember. But when my dad had a traumatic brain injury about 10 years ago, and their house was not handicap accessible in any way. I mean, it was like a 110-year-old house. And while my dad, he was in inpatient rehab for 6 months after his brain injury. And while he was at the hospital doing rehab, some of my parents' friends from church, about 6, 8 guys, demolished the back porch and half bath that was on the first level of my parents' house and built an ADA compliant bathroom for my parents so that my dad could come home. And the only compensation they accepted from my mom was Diet Mountain Dew and Oreos. So mom would go to the store and pick up 24 packs of Diet Mountain Dew and packs of Oreos and leave them on the counter. And the guys would come over and work for a few hours. And that was the deal. My mom had to pay for the supplies as well for the bathroom. But that was one of those moments for me where I was like, we pay for communal life. Everybody pays for communal life in some way. Some of us, the most common way most of us pay for it is with money. But that can leave a lot of people left out who don't have the means to be able to do X or Y when they're in crisis. And what I saw with my parents' example is my parents had kind of paid for that bathroom through decades of faithful friendship and care in their church. And so when they were in need, there was a half dozen guys from their church that were almost insulted at the thought of needing to be paid with money for this work. Because, no, we love you, we love Rob, we want him to be able to be home. And if this is what you need, then we're just going to do it. And they made it happen. So there's a kind of relational currency, or like social capital is the term you'll hear sometimes as well. That we cultivate over time that can pay for communal life in a different way.
That's beautiful.